Well, welcome everyone to this special online seminar from History and Policy. I'm Philip Murphy, I'm Director of History and Policy, which is a network of historians which has existed since 2002 with the intention of bringing historical expertise to policymaking and to encourage an engagement between academic historians and policymakers. This online seminar today is going to look across the Atlantic to the think tank world of the United States, and it's going to ask a series of questions, really. What, in the American case, the links between that very vibrant think tank community and historians, academic historians? What do people in the think tank world in the UK see as the strengths and weaknesses of that think tank community? What in broader terms are the challenges, if you like, of attempting to make a genuine impact on policymakers if we are serious as historians with engaging with them? And I think that importantly for history and policy, which has just moved back to its original home in the Institute of Historical Research, and we're thinking about the future and planning our strategy for the future, what are the potentials for collaboration amongst the various organizations in the UK, in Europe, and in North America, and indeed elsewhere in the world, that are interested in this area of policy engagement. We started really by commissioning a paper by my colleague Jacob Ford, who's going to be co-chairing today, on the US think tank world, and we put a link to that in the chat. It's available on our website as what we call a policy paper, and Jacob's paper is sort of the jumping off point to that. So if you haven't already had a look at it, please do so at some stage. We have four distinguished speakers with us today. Well, I say with us, James G Mcgann, who is really I suppose the foremost academic thinker in the US on think tanks, is unable to make this slot tonight. So what he's done very kindly is to record a presentation for us, which is just it's a little bit longer than the other presentations, and we're going to truncate it a little bit just to give everyone the chance to discuss and ask questions. But Jim's full recording will be made available in the final record of this seminar. With Jim on this virtual panel are Jill Bennett, who is a Senior Associate Fellow of the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. She was Chief Historian at the Foreign Office from 1995 to 2005, and Senior Editor of Official History of British Foreign Policy Documents on British Policy Overseas. With her is Catherine Haddon, who is the Institute for Government's Principal Historian and leads the Institute's work on changes of government, ministers, and the workings of the Constitution. She also leads the Institute's professional development program for ministers and opposition parties. And finally, Calder Walton, who is Assistant Director of the Belfer Center's Applied History Project at the Harvard Kennedy School. Like Jill, Calder has a very strong interest in intelligence history, and his book, Empire of Secrets, looked at surveillance within the British Empire around the time of decolonization. So I'm going to ask each of those three first speakers just to make some introductory remarks for about 10 minutes. We will have a discussion amongst the panelists for another 10 or 15 minutes, and then we will play Jim Mcgann's presentation and follow up with some final comments and questions from the floor. Usual Zoom protocols apply. Please mute yourself if you're not speaking. Do use the chat function to raise questions. And this session is being recorded for your information. So let me begin by thanking our panelists for taking part and asking Jill to make the first presentation.
Thank you, Philip. I'm coming at this, as you explained in your introduction, from, I hate to say this, but almost half a century of working as a historian within government, principally with the Foreign Office in its various incarnations, but also with the Cabinet Office and indeed with some other departments as well. And so you could say I've been an applied historian for a very, very long time. Now, in the Foreign Office, as Philip said, I am now, in fact, for the last 15 years, I've been first an associate fellow and latterly a senior associate fellow at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. But while I was still working within the Foreign Office as a historian, there is regular interaction between the Foreign Office and various think tanks, including RUSI. Obviously, RUSI has this very strong military element, though not exclusively by any means. It has a lot of interaction with the MOD, but it also has interaction with the Foreign Office, and so do some other think tanks, including Chatham House, for example, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. So I'd certainly come across those. I should perhaps just say a little bit about, for anybody who doesn't know, what, for example, the Foreign Office historians do, which is principally, apart from producing the official history of British foreign policy, is to give what's called historical advice to ministers and senior officials, which is exactly the kind of thing we're talking about in the think tank world as well. And Jim Mcgann, who you will see later on, a paper which was circulated, I mean, it struck me one thing his particular says is to have meaningful effect, think tanks must place relevant analysis in the right hands, in the right format, at the right time. Now, of course, that is absolutely right, but that is equally true for historians like myself who work within government. And it's one of the abiding problems of bringing together government, think tanks, and indeed academia is all the expertise may be out there, but it's no good unless you can get it to the right place at the right time. And if a minister wants to know about something, they don't want a beautifully researched paper next month or even next week. They want half a side of A4 paper before lunchtime. And the art of providing history that actually has some impact within government is to be able to tailor it that way and to be able to understand sufficiently about the workings of government from the inside so that you know how to present what's needed and when to present it. And this is very much, I'm sure this will be, in a way, it seems self-evident, but it is actually really important. And I think this is where think tanks can play a very particular role, because certainly, I mean, I can't speak for US think tanks. My experience of them is joining their wonderful seminars. I don't know a lot about the organization and so on. But the British think tanks that I've dealt with, and certainly RUSI, they often have former or indeed current practitioners from parts of government or from the armed forces or from the intelligence services playing a part, especially recently retired ones. And their experience, which is not just a question of professional expertise, but understanding how government works, is absolutely invaluable. And it seems that to me, that the mixture of research, obviously, new thinking and professional expertise is what makes think tanks potentially so very valuable. Now, you know, we talk about think tanks, but actually they, as everybody will say, they come in all shapes and sizes, and they deal with a huge range of different different areas of expertise. And of course, they come from different parts of the political spectrum as well. So we all know if we hear the name of some think tanks, we think, well, they're coming from the right, or they tend to come from the left, or they have an economic slant, or they're very much geared to political science. So it isn't a one size fits all, but I still think the underlying principle that in order to present make sure that the work they're doing is really impactful and relevant to the work of government, this very close understanding of how government works is absolutely central. And Catherine, of course, is very experienced in this area. Just to give you an idea, for example, of over the pandemic period, some of the areas that the Foreign Office historians with whom I'm still attached on a part-time basis, some of the things we have been asked to work on include historical revisionism, particularly in the context, for example, of the reinterpretation of certain Second World War happenings by President Putin, but not only by President Putin, the colonial legacy and the increasingly difficult dialogue that's going on about artworks, for example, in the Foreign Office. That's been a very hot topic. We have been setting up over a few years now a kind of ready reference online tool, an internal tool for members of the Foreign Office, where if they come across something in their daily work, some historical episode or treaty or something, and they think, well, I've heard of that, but what is it? This is something where they can get a little potted, we call it Historipedia, a little potted account of whatever it is, but most importantly, the first paragraph is always current FCO relevance, i.e. why does it matter now? So this is the kind of thing, because we know, because of all this experience, how you have to inject historical knowledge, not just for ministers, but actually for desk officers and people working day-to-day in government. So that's really what my background is. And in RUSI, the work I do with RUSI, one of the other things that G Mcgann brought up was that historians are underrepresented in think tanks. I'm not sure how true that is in the UK. It depends what you mean by historians. You have a lot of people who may not be historians, but they have a very great amount of historical understanding or knowledge, and you can tap into it. But I regard my role, in particular with events at RUSI, things I'm involved with as a chairman quite often, or an interlocutor, is bringing a historical perspective to a current event or a current subject of study. So I'll finish up with this. To give you an example, an event I did for RUSI with Sir John Scarlett, the former chief of the Secret Intelligence Service, where we were saying how Russia sees the world, making the basic argument that you've got to think how things look from Moscow as well as how things look from where we are. But John Scarlett has a very great knowledge about Russia, and he served there and he has a lot of knowledge about it, but he's more on the contemporary side, and I was bringing in the historical side. And we find that the sort of thing I do with RUSI is to bring the two sides together and to make sure that the history part of current events does not go by default. I better stop there, Philip.
Thank you very much indeed, John. That's wonderful. Catherine, would you like to come in now?
Thank you. So as a bit of an explanation, I'm also, I guess, an applied historian. Philip's very kindly, and thank you for having me here today. This is good to be discussing this again. Very kindly referred to me as the principal historian. Actually, it started off as a joke that one of my colleagues called me the pet historian of the Institute for Government. And then this evolved over time to being called the resident historian. And so I put this on my biography initially as a bit of a joke, but it's sort of actually turned into something as a sort of way of thinking about my role in the Institute, but also the way of, bringing more attention to the value that history can have. And I mean, yes, in some respects, I'm similar to what Jill did in her career, albeit there's some very big differences. But day to day, I am also finding myself thinking about how to apply history. That, you know, it's rarely that there isn't a day when I'm thinking about some precedent to something I'm looking at. I'm explaining the origins of something, you know, whether to colleagues or to somebody externally, or just, you know, thinking about the way in which history actually has some bearing and the sort of longer time frames in which you can look at a problem. But as Jill says, it's, you know, part of that is about tailoring that history to the audience. It's not just about the past. There's a lot of interest in the past. You only need to look at Twitter to see how many accounts there are now that are sort of tweeting out past events day by day, you know, the First World War, the Second World War. There's all sorts of very niche accounts where you can get lots of lovely little historical facts, and then people will, you know, if my feed is anything to go with, and including replies to me is anything to go with, people love to have a debate about who is most accurate about a particular historical fact. So there's definitely interest in the past. But what I'm really interested is in how we think about history, not just as the past, but actually about the methodology and you know, and the ways of thinking that history brings. So that's when you start to think about the professionalism that academic historians, anyone who's had a historical training, can bring to bear on this, because this isn't just about being able to tell tales from the past, but it's also about the methodologies that you're taught in terms of how to research it, how to conceive of it, and then also how to recount it. And that's something that likewise comes up time and again in the work that I do. Jacob, in his excellent paper, has referenced something that I did a few years ago with the Arts and Humanities Research Council, where we brought together officials from several different departments, particularly looking at the Treasury and the impact of the financial crash. We brought together people from what was then communities and local government before it even became housing, let alone levelling up. Another historical tale about departments and their name changes is something I'm often dragged into. Talking about social cohesion and communities policy, and then also people from the Foreign Office and from what was then the Department for International Development, talking about history in their role. And what was most interesting in that, but also most frustrating, is a lot of people love history when it comes to Whitehall, but actually the Foreign Office and to some extent the Cabinet Office are quite rare in terms of developing a proper historical function. And more than that, it's something that is often cited. People will talk about learning lessons from history, learning lessons from the past, or how much they enjoy history. Our Prime Minister will talk about that. But there's very few that will actually focus on the idea of using it professionally. So we probed that a bit, and we started to come and talk about the value of history in terms of particularly conceptual frameworks. And we talked about sometimes it is just simply the past, it's the background to a policy. And I could talk for 10 minutes alone about the problems of institutional memory in Whitehall and how, you know, that is a massive resource that Whitehall is wasting. Others are historical parallels, and Jill's just talked about a few, but that particularly came out from the Treasury. The then Permanent Secretary, Nicholas Macpherson, you know, repeatedly talked about how important it was just having had read a few books about previous fiscal crises, so that when it hit in 2008, you know, they could start to conceive of how the world can be very different, because so many officials had only really been in the Treasury throughout the period since Gordon Brown had been in. They hadn't experienced a recession, let alone a crash of this kind of scale. So the idea of the things they were doing, they needed those historical parallels just to think about things very differently. So likewise, talking about paradigm shifts, you know, Jill's talked about Russia. That was something that was brought up in our discussions about Russia's intervention in Ukraine that required immediate reaction, and also then posed deeper questions about the UK and Western policy, and how had we been framing things since the end of the Cold War? How much did we actually need to rethink the way in which we were conceiving of Russia? And there's also historical reference points that was brought up about how that might change over generations. There was a really interesting point that was made about how you had the debate over whether or not we should take military intervention in Syria. And there were different historical views, partly dependent on the age of civil servants. Some were remembering the intervention in Iraq and its consequences. And so, you know, the idea of intervention was something that they considered very difficult, potentially, you know, hugely controversial. Others were older, still very much influenced by the earlier lack of intervention in Bosnia. And so it created a very different sort of point of historical reference point for them. There was also understanding political narratives. And again, that's kind of what Jill has talked about in terms of how things are conceived differently. But the Treasury, in the Treasury discussions, they talked about how under Labour and Conservative governments, politicians tended to mythologize their predecessors. So, you know, the history of the Labour Chancellor, Philip Snowden, was viewed very differently depending on whether you're a Labour or a Conservative Chancellor. The experience of the 1970s, the 1981 budget, the Lawson boom, these were all different things. And you still see that today as the two parties effectively are having, you know, a contestation over who owns that history and which party is actually the party of sound finance or not. It's something where historical narratives fit very closely with parties' perception of how well they'll do with the electorate. There's lots of others. There was framing the terms of debates that came up when we were talking about communities and the need to understand how different communities within the UK understand the kinds of issues that we're talking about, whether you use terms like multiculturalism or cohesion. Again, depending on your perspective, these terms can have different meanings. Some can be more loaded, some can change over time. And again, you only need to look at the so-called culture wars to see different ways in which people are using terminology over time and are meaning very different things with it. And then there was also something again that Jill brought up, which was understanding different historical perspectives. And this was particularly raised with international development about the need for participants the need for policymakers, as one participant put it, to talk to people, not about them. So the need to understand when you're talking about communities abroad and international development, you have to understand their history, their perspective. You can't just come at it from a very UK-centered approach. So it's something day to day that you know, policymakers are using out there in the world. And similarly, historical partiality, you know, humanitarianism itself, is that a very Western narrative? And, you know, how much is that something that has been driven by the West and is understood very differently? Again, we've got COP26 going on at the moment. It's a very live debate about how much that is something that has been Western focused and how that very discussion has changed over time. So it's fascinating from that point of view. But I'd go a bit further than I did in that report to talk about some of the impact of all of this, because it isn't just about those sort of framing of debates. It's also about the pure methodology that professional historians can bring to bear on policy making and on politics and government. And there's things like the treatment of evidence. You know, this is something that is crucial in the research that we do, thinking about how do you balance the perspectives of different people that you've interviewed, the other sources that you might use. I'm constantly talking to political scientists who are doing work on civil service reform, and they will often take the government document as published as being the guide to this is what the government intended and had to do. Whereas I know from talking to plenty of officials that this is a compromise document that has been through all manner of internal squabbles and so forth, and eventually was the thing that they published and isn't necessarily the thing that they then went to do. So you really have to get beyond that into the evidence to understand what really happened, which leads you to causality. So COVID, the discussions we're going to have in the COVID inquiry are going to be predominantly about causality. What happened when, and what was the major factor that led to a particular decision happening. So it's a crucial methodology. Jill's also talked about, I talked about it again there, the narratives that people tell. I mean, you only need to look at Dominic Cummings, the phenomenon that is Dominic Cummings, to see him with a contested narrative where he's trying to put one perspective across, the Prime Minister's got a different perspective, and that clash is playing out, over our social media. But there's also the methodologies in terms of how we then present information, and storytelling and narrative is something that, again, historians have to think about time and again, because we write, we speak in a linear form. So a narrative ends up bringing out in terms of how we decide what to say in what order. So as we think about the reports that we write, as we think about the events that we do, the audio, visual, the Twitter account, you know, everything, all of those communication tools of thinking about how you're telling stories, how you're using narrative. But more than that, I do work with ministers, with civil servants and beyond. We have a project called Ministers Reflect, where we've interviewed more than 100 former ministers about their own experience in government. And again, there you see the stories that they tell themselves come out very strongly in the way in which they recount, respond to the questions we ask, remember their time, you know, the fickleness of memory. It's another issue that comes up there. But also, as we then do the professional development, the reason why we did all those interviews is because we found that politicians learn best when being told other stories. Sometimes you can bring different forms of evidence, but oftentimes their experience working with constituents, talking to other politicians, a lot of that is about storytelling. I'm going to stop there. I could also mention precedents in the Constitution, which is something I'm particularly exercised about at the moment, but I'll leave it there because we'll have plenty to discuss in the conversation after.
Thank you very much indeed, Catherine. And finally over to Calder.
Thanks, Philip, and thanks, Kath, and thanks, Jill, for the comments already. It's great to see everyone, some familiar faces. So I thought that it'd be helpful for me to describe some of the initiatives that we're undertaking here at the Applied History Project at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. I have sort of two jobs here. I'm the assistant director of that project, and then I'm the director of research of the Intelligence Project. And there's a nice synergy in my work between applied history and intelligence history, studying intelligence and national security. So how do we understand applied history? Well, really, we take the inspiration from the manifesto, the Applied History Manifesto, written by my colleagues, Graham Allison and Neil Ferguson. Applied history being the express effort to use history to clarify choices and to better inform decision-making. We see our mission here to advance the field of applied history as broadly as possible. This can be through, and we should also say that the Kennedy School of Government is an unusual think tank in that it is part of a university. So part of our mission here of advancing applied history is through teaching and through undergraduate and graduate seminars. We have an applied history fellowship, the Ernest May Fellowship, with pre-docs and postdocs each year, and we've got 7 outstanding fellows this year and more next year coming. This is an effort to train the next generation of applied historians. That is to say, historians who don't run away from using the past with some sort of basis for utility today in terms of informing decision making. Far from it. We want historians to embrace that and to analyze really through the methodology set out by Ernest May and Dick Neustadt in their book Thinking in Time, grappling with both similarities and differences when it comes to past precedents, analogs, similarities with those issues today. We produce some research papers on events, on conferences, and particular topics. So some of the ones, and actually this is over the last year, this has really been a transformation, I think, of where we all right now are speaking Zoom and the online platform. We've seen an exponential increase in the number of people reading our reports, the big reports that we write. So we had a big online conference on intelligence and national security and climate change, and that used embedded videos and talking heads in the report, and it got a significant attraction online, as we can see through the website. we had a 20-year anniversary conference on 9/11 with, again, similar format of using videos and talking heads and key moments instead of just a dry text. We've got a report on the bringing historical perspectives to the Havana syndrome phenomenon that's coming out tomorrow, either later today or tomorrow. I'd like to highlight two things that we've undertaken since the pandemic that I think have had an impact, a beneficial impact on public policy. One is through public competitions on pressing issues of importance. So when the pandemic struck, we launched a public competition for 10 weeks to try to bring historical perspective to what we were seeing unfolding. This was through the generosity of a foundation here, the Stanton Foundation. And I'll put the links to the winning essays in the chat afterwards. And they were judged each week, and there were grand winners. And then, so that was in 2020. Then in 2021, we repeated this idea for one competition, one subject, which was reunifying the United States of America, how to go about doing that, using history to inform ways to think about bringing together this incredibly divided and polarized society. And again, I'll put them in. I'll put the winners in the chat box there. The winning competition was by Tony Gregg, a historian at the University of Staffordshire, about experiences from Northern Ireland and analogues there for the United States today. And we broadcast these, the winners in the competitions widely and through personal contacts in the US government and beyond. So that's one way that I think might translate across the Atlantic for us to think about holding competitions to bring historical perspectives, to apply history to particular decisions and issues. And then there's the next big issue that we're thinking about seriously at this point here is creating an executive education program. So that's actually the idea being a short course that policymakers, assessment staff can come on and to actually learn the historian's trade, the historian's toolkit, and to understand how to apply, and then most importantly, or I'd say even more importantly, the dangers of misapplying history. So this is very much work in progress. It's something that we're actively looking at right now. And again, I think it might well translate across the other side of the Atlantic, the executive education course. So I think that's sort of the tour of the horizon from my perspective here. And I'll hand back to you, Phil.
Thank you. I know Jacob wants to come in with a question. I'll bring him in a second. But I just, because Jill and Calder particularly, you've both been involved in some pretty hefty works of official history. I mean, the documents on British foreign policy. Calder was involved with a very extensive authorized history, and Catherine's involved in, as is Calder, in executive education. Some of those models, those old models of the kind of the official history, and they're great. They're great works of scholarship, and I've been involved in an element of that myself with British documents on the end of empire. But they're not the sort of thing that are going to grab the attention of policymakers. And Jim, who will speak in a minute, says, politicians don't read books. So what are the tricks? What are the rhetorical tricks, if you like, for grabbing the attention of policymakers, putting over important messages? And what does new technology add in terms of the dissemination of history in ways that might have an impact on policymakers? Jill, if I can ask you to go first.
Well, I think as far as the trick goes, I mean, the trick is that in a way, Kath alluded to, that you don't, it's no good just telling. It's no good saying, well, this is what happened last time. That has, no, you're quite right. Ministers and senior officials absolutely don't use our volumes or official histories very much in any sense. They're really far more used in academia and indeed by think tanks and by all sorts of scholars. But the trick that we've always found in doing this is that you want to say, you might like to consider this point. I just give you a very brief example, which came up more recently than some, which was to do with Ireland and to do with the record of Sir Roger Casement, who, as you know, was the writer of some very controversial diaries. And I was involved in a meeting where somebody said, well, because there was some question of it was in the context of commemorating the Easter Rising, I suppose 100 years on, so it's about 5 years ago. Well, nobody minds now that Casement was gay. It's, this is no longer a thing. So we could do that, but our little historical injection was to say, yes, but he was actually a paedophile. Now, obviously, I don't mean he was a convicted paedophile, but we know from the diaries that it was boys, underage boys, that he was interested in. Now, this may seem a very small thing, but actually, we didn't put it quite like that, but you want to explain, well, the historical background of this isn't enough so that the policymakers think, well, we don't want to, we steer away from this. So if there's something really tricky, you don't want to say, well, this is what happened last time and we couldn't possibly do it again. You want to say, you might like to consider the context in which this kind of issue has come up before and steer people towards, it's all methodology, as Cass says. It is a trick. If you want to get noticed, it is a trick, I'm afraid.
Catherine, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'd say, and this isn't just a problem that, historians face. So we do a lot of training with academics, including we run a 3-day course for AHRC, which includes obviously historians as well as others under their remit, on how to engage with policymakers, how to have impact and so forth. It's not just a problem that academics face. This is a problem that think tanks generally face. And it is, a lot of this actually is in Jacob's paper, that you can't just write really long reports and expect people to read it. You've got to think about the new methodologies that are growing up. And this is something we're constantly thinking about. Somebody proposed recently, well, let's just ban any reports longer than 20 pages. We're not quite doing that. For the same reason, actually, why I think official histories still have value is that they're a resource. You have to think about the difference between when you want to grab someone's attention, communicate something to them rapidly, have them understand that this is an issue they need to explore further, or understand the parameters of the issue, or sell a message to them, or whatever it is that you're trying to do. That's one thing, you have to understand the purpose of why you're trying to communicate to them. That doesn't mean that you can't have your stock of knowledge existing somewhere. And again, it's something that, we're constantly talking about with our researchers, where we will do projects, and I've done this many times, where you want to write a long explanation of what the problem is, what the background to it is, the long history of this policy area or this reform of government or whatever. And that always goes in your first chapter. And pretty much universally now we cut that out because it won't help us make the argument. So it's kind of, don't bury the lead. Start off with, what is your argument? What are you saying that's new? How are you trying to communicate that? How are you trying to grab their attention? It's the elevator pitch effectively. And again, it isn't just historians. I've seen this with academics more generally, where they will get an opportunity to go and do a presentation in Whitehall, and we'll start off with sort of the methodology. or the caveats, or will do a long lead into it. Now, sometimes there are some events that I go to. Number 10 has its own history seminar series for Number 10 staff, which is quite fascinating. The Cabinet Office in 2016, it was the 100-year anniversary, so we ran a lot of events for them there. And since then, I've still been doing stuff where former cabinet secretaries come back, and this staff who are, again, very young. A lot of them have only come in since Brexit, let alone ever experienced a Labour government. So for them to hear Robin Butler talking about what it was like in the 1980s, they love that. So sometimes they do want the stories and do want the background. But if you've got a key message that you're trying to get to them, this isn't your chance to sort of show off everything you know. This is how to get to the punchline first of all, and leave them wanting more and come back to you if that's what they want. So just understand what it is that you're trying to do and why.
Can I just add a tiny bit to that, Philip? Because
yes,
that's precisely, when you talked about technology, that's precisely why in the Foreign Office we set up this Historipedia, because we found that young officers at desks would come across something and they'd say, well, why is this? I mean, it might be even something like Munich. Why do people keep talking about Munich? Well, there are endless books written on Munich, but we keep these entries to not more than, if you like, a page and a half. And the first paragraph is always, why is this? Why are you likely to come across this in your daily work?
Yeah.
And why is it still important to those people who keep mentioning it? But as Kath said, at the end of the entry, then we have a little list of where you can find a lot more about it if you want to, good books or articles or whatever it is. But we found that young people, particularly young officials, as they come into the office really quite recently, they haven't the faintest idea what you're talking about. Even something like, like the Falklands, like the sinking of the Belgrano. It's ancient history to them.
So that's another point I would make, is that one of the things that we do at IFG, we do a lot of explainers, usually when it's focused on our area, but we're very concerned with SEO and whether or not we come up on the first page of sort of Google search. Do not underestimate how much Whitehall policy work starts with people going on Google and searching. And if you're a historian, you ought to consider whether or not, if people are using Wikipedia, you want them to understand the truth and to find your work, and whether you ought to be an editor on that. And I say that as somebody who's never tried. So, but it's a good question for the historical community as to whether or not we should be making sure that Wikipedia works, because it's too late. It's out there.
Thank you. Calder, would you like to come in on this?
Yeah, fascinating discussion. Thank you. I mean, one of the points that Graham Allison and Neil Ferguson suggested in their Applied History Manifesto was to create a council of historical advisors for the White House, similar to the Council of Economic Advisors. That hasn't so far been successful, although President Biden did bring in a group of historians to advise him and have a discussion. I'm hoping that what they discussed will be revealed. I've been watching carefully, not yet. If we were to institutionalize historians in the US within the executive branch, it seems to me that we have a lot of learning to do from the body of knowledge already acquired about effective briefing, and maybe in particular intelligence briefings to the president. So how do you go about balancing that very fine line between delivering a succinct message that is accurate and not bastardizing and doing violence to the subject at hand? And that's where, at least in the intelligence community, they have extraordinary editors who are able to synthesize language effectively. And to the point that we've already been talking about, using new media, using video. And certainly, I'll just speak briefly to my own experience with the book I'm writing at the moment, finishing, called spies the 100-year intelligence war between East and West. And both publishers and policymakers have emphasized to me from the outset how important it will be for the book to be more than just a book. It needs to be, in this day and age, a website, an interactive website with underlying documents attached to it, with video, with a podcast, and if possible, TV program as well. So this is more than we want to think about delivery of historical learning, to your point, Philip, in more than just black and white. We have to find ways of delivering this succinctly, but accurately, in all the new way, through all the new media.
Thank you very much. I know that Jill has got to step off.
I've got to go. I'm very sorry. I'm doing another of these.
But thank you so much for joining us, Jill. And
thank you. Nice to see everybody.
Thank you. And I'll hand over to my colleague Jacob Ford, who I think would like to ask the next question, and then we'll go to G Mcgann's presentation.
Thank you very much, Philip, and thank you very much also to our panelists for their contributions. I wanted to pick up on a methodological point. Something I'm particularly interested in is metaphorical thinking. And I wondered if in your work with politicians, you've encountered an interest in using historical metaphors and analogies, perhaps in speech writing or in communicating policies to the public.
Catherine, do you want to go first?
Well, I was going to offer it to Calder whilst I was pondering that. I don't know whether you'd call it a metaphor, but I have encountered it, but the major part in which I've encountered it is a problem, which is, as I say, at the moment, I think one of the biggest issues in our politics, well, there's two, and they're related. One is contested history, even recent history, and the other is the impact of social media and exacerbating that. And in both of those, you see, I guess, historical metaphors. I mean, at a very cliched level, even yesterday it was the Archbishop of Canterbury was referencing the 1930s in terms of COP and got into massive problems over it. And, it's a sort of become a bit of a joke now of how long before an internet argument descends into discussing the 1930s, the Second World War and so forth. But you do see a lot at the moment. We've seen throughout Brexit, not just that, but contested history of what people wanted to compare it to. We saw it throughout the Trump presidency of people reaching for almost, what is the precedent to this? How bad is it? What period in history do we compare it to? And they're always reaching for dictators, for the worst moments in our history to try and compare. There's not a lot of nuanced understanding there. It's often grabbing for what's the most eye-catching historical metaphor to try and emphasize your point. And I think that it is in danger to hyperbole, and it means that those times that actually we do need to talk about parallels to some of the worst moments in the world's history, it becomes very difficult to do so because it becomes such a cliche. So I think it's a wider, sorry to have turned it quite negative, but I actually think it's a wider problem in terms of the, whether you call it the historical literacy of how people reach into the past to try and bring out parallels and metaphors and precedents. I've got tired of the number of times when I get asked to go on the media and I'm asked, is this unprecedented? I mean, throughout Brexit, it was always, is this unprecedented? Is it? And it's like, well, I don't know. I mean, I can't go back into every moment in time, but it just becomes an moot word after a while because it doesn't have meaning, because in essence everything is unprecedented because you won't have the exact combination of things happening. So I think it's more of a problem that I encounter. That said, I find more in terms of historical parallels actually bringing it back to the individual, which is why I talk about ministers reflect, because it's almost, politicians, when they're internalizing knowledge, when you can bring it back to an experience or to an encounter that somebody else went through, that is what helps them internalize it more, because they can sort of compare it to their own experience. They can think of it on a sort of what it's like for another human. As soon as you bring it back to a structural level, it tends to sort of dissipate a little bit, and it's harder for them to grasp at. It's also an interesting phenomenon with politicians that, yes, in their speeches, in their ways of talking and so forth, they are oftentimes using storytelling and narratives, particularly from their constituents. You know, another cliche is that Boris Johnson didn't do it this time, but in leader speeches at party conferences, there's always, oh, I spoke to Jim or Sally or whoever, and some random person that may or may not be real that they encountered, and they want to tell their story. I mean, even this time round, Keir Starmer was using his own story as a way of trying to communicate to the public. So, sorry, I'm not sure that's fully answered your question, because it's slightly broadened it out into storytelling rather than anything else.
It's very interesting. Calder, would you like to come in?
It's really interesting, the question of metaphors. I mean, analogues. I would perhaps reframe the question. Do we experience policymakers, target audience, reaching for analogues? Yes, everything is Munich, everything. So it's a continual battle to try to do away with that. But actually, I think that part of the purpose of applied history is not to run away from analogues, precedents, but to actually embrace them. And that's where I mentioned the Ernest May method, the Neustadt's method, where they said in their book, Thinking in Time, you know, that if you are confronted with a problem that looks new, but you think there might be a precedent for, get a piece of paper, divide it into two, and to write down similarities and differences. And although it's rather simplistic, that actually really can work. And then you can actually tabulate, well, how similar is this to the past and how different? The big debate at the moment in the US is whether we here are in a new Cold War with China, and whether that term is useful to describe the struggle underway between the US and China. Point you in the direction of the Foreign Affairs article special issue that just came out last week with a collection of essays on this, and whether, I mean, not expressly done, but it does embrace that Ernest May method of looking at similarities and differences. So I think that it's natural for its human nature to look to something that is familiar, and it's incredibly important for applied historians to actually judge whether that is a valid comparison or whether you're doing violence to the history.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry, Philip, can I just add a thought that Calder's made, because I mean, he knows my background, Philip, you know as well, before I came to do government, was also intelligence history, Cold War and so forth. I think also we as historians have to be wary of reaching for our favourite parallels and metaphors and so forth, because, I mean, Calder, let's be honest, it's quite tempting for us to reach back into that familiar territory where we have really over-examined the Cold War. We know so much about it. So if we can find useful lessons there, it's very tempting to reach for that. Whereas if we say, oh, perhaps this is something more akin to some period in the 19th century, I certainly wouldn't feel comfortable with that because I don't know enough of it. So is there a danger that we reach for what we want to talk about, if you see what I mean?
Definitely.
Thank you. Yeah. Let's pause for a moment, and I'm going to ask Gemma to play the recording that G Mcgann made earlier today, and you'll see that some of the same issues come up, but some broader points as well. And I think in the last 15 minutes of this seminar, we'll then have a think and go over some of these and perhaps think about some things we haven't touched on. It gives me great pleasure to introduce James G Mcgann, who is director of the Think Tanks and Civil Societies Programme and is senior fellow at the Fels Institute of Government at the University of Pennsylvania. He served as consultant and advisor to a range of major organizations, from the World Bank and the UN to the Soros, Rockefeller, and Gates foundations. And I think it's not too much to say that Jim Mcgann is really the leading academic commentator on think tanks in the United States, and we're delighted that he's able to contribute. So, Jim, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be with you, and the issues that you and your fellow historians are struggling with, I have struggled with my entire academic career and have focused on how to bridge the gap between knowledge and policy, and specifically as it refers to disciplines such as political science, history, and other social sciences that may or may not be well represented in the policy decisions and policies that are made by governments and policymakers around the world. I always start with the definition of think tanks because I think it also underscores what I will attempt to explore, one in terms of the history and bridge between history and policy, which is one thing that I'll address at the outset. Two, the sort of transnational, transatlantic dimensions of the issue and research questions that I have explored during my entire career. And I'm reluctant to say, to describe American exceptionalism, since that is one of the frameworks. It wasn't quite framed in that way. It was really about how is the difference between the US and Europe and the UK specifically, but I will address that because I think it's an important element in this discussion. And then the third section would be on the clash of cultures, which is fundamentally what all of this is about, and we need to understand that, and I hope to bring some of that into focus. There is a struggle, clearly, in terms of this first segment that I'll talk about, between knowledge and policy, between knowledge and power, and the attraction and repulsion of that in terms of academics. But in terms of my definition of think tanks, which is really play a key function in terms of bridging the gap between knowledge and power, think tanks are public policy research, analysis, and engagement institutions. Now, most academics would agree that and have no problem with research and analysis. The engagement part has been challenging, and and part of the whole focus of this is on the issue of fundamentally engagement to a certain degree about designing and conducting research and how you do that and how that impacts the utilization of policy, but it is also about engagement. And so as I've said at the outset, emphasis has been, how do we bridge the gap between knowledge and policy? And clearly a part of that, and once again, there are problematic elements to a definition or focus that I think is important. One, the sort of pervasive focus on evidence-based policy, that all decisions should be informed, all analysis should be informed by evidence. But the other part, which many historians, political scientists, lawyers seem to forget, is it must be policy relevant. And the issue I think at hand is whether there's an interest, how to bridge and encourage and engage historians, political scientists in the policy relevant dimension of it. It's not terribly difficult on the evidence-based, but even in these times that are polarized, but evidence-based is something that most academics are comfortable, vast majority, but they aren't not necessarily comfortable with policy relevant. And, I'll come back to this later. Secondly, as I said, engagement. Those are the two things where I think wherein the problem lies and where we need to do, and historians need to do a much better job. There are those who have in the US, and I'll focus on those and reference some of those in the UK, but I'll focus principally on those who have been effective in terms of bridging the gap. Part of the issue, I think, was in a cartoon that had Al Capone, who was a famous gangster in Chicago, driving a truck, and a policeman stopped him and asked him, because it was suspicious, "What's in that truck?" And the driver, Al Capone, responded, "Booze." And the policeman said, "Drive on. I thought it was full of history books." And so the dim view of history is reflected in that cartoon. But there are those, and I would, in the US context, Arthur Schlesinger, Andrew Armitage, Graham Allison, who have effectively connected and been engaged in applying history to public policy. Graham Allison, made use of probably the most famous historian in his most recent book in terms of Thucydides, the Thucydides trap as it relates to China. And so there are those who have effectively applied it, has tremendous impact on policy. But those are few and far between, and I would now move to the clash of cultures in terms of why so few historians, political scientists go into government, are utilized by policymakers. And there are a number of factors, and unfortunately the list is long, and I will go through them. One is the time frame. Policymakers, and in terms of this clash of cultures between those policymakers and academics, and supposedly think tanks are the bridge between knowledge and policy, and act as a conduit for that, and a human resource function. But the reality is that the feeder for think tanks, the culture of think tanks, and the vast majority of them are defined by the academic culture. And so the problems, the issues that impede the utilization of knowledge in policy are visited upon think tanks, because most of the disciplines, most of the culture have been incorporated and have been the dominant models for think tanks, which is the academic model. That's changing, but it is a reality. And so first and foremost, the timeframes are fundamentally different between policymakers and scholars. Scholars are on a longer time frame, whereas policymakers are meeting the challenges of the day in a much shorter time frame. That creates a clash of, I need it now, I need it in, and where it's just not a part of the academic culture and incentives, which I'll come back to. Secondly, the products, the outputs are fundamentally different and are changing. And I think the larger issue here is, that there are historical impediments, but then there are more recent trends that are intensifying and accelerating, and academics and the approach to research analysis and its policy relevance, which the world cries for and needs ideas and information, is fundamentally shifting and accelerating and intensifying. And COVID has demonstrated that most dramatically. The products and outputs are different. The incentives within the academic realm are to be published in discipline-specific journals and books. That has of little utility or interest by policymakers. They don't read. They don't have time to read. and understanding that reality, but also understanding the obligation and importance to inform policymakers, to engage them so that they make informed and right decisions is an awesome one, but it's not going to be through books and journals. Technology, the acceleration in terms of the internet, social media, AI, all of these things are compounding and accelerating the time frame, shortening it, intensifying it, and the flow of information is moving at an accelerated rate, and most academics are not prepared to meet that new reality. The incentives within academia in terms of tenure go counter to what the needs are and to the reality of the world that we live in, meaning in terms of tenure and the need to get tenure, and that is based on publish or perish still, and is focused on and published or perish in books or journals and very specialized journals, not just a general policy oriented journal. So the over specialization creates another barrier, because the language, the overly specialized, the silo effect that is created by these specializations mitigate the need to essentially engage, the need to be broader in terms of examining problems. The reality and other unfortunate element, which is made clear by virtually every major policy problem we have, is interdisciplinary, that you can't understand or solve the world's problems from a single discipline, and therefore, and the over-specialization, the dominance of what I call the tyranny of academic disciplines makes it impossible to do interdisciplinary research. The most ill-fated programs on most academic campuses are scholars who attempt to be interdisciplinary, and interdisciplinary programs where you have political science, philosophy, and sociology teaching a joint course. Too costly, doesn't happen, and is discouraged by and large. Those things need to change. History and the focus, which is specific on history, is really focused on the past, not the here and now, and policymakers are living and dying in terms of their careers in the here and now. I was struck by the new book by the historian in terms of his book on Sapiens, in which he said, and I think it is a paradigm shift that needs to be embraced by the community of historians, is that history is about the future and change, not about the past. History is about the future and change, and not about the past. That is a fundamental paradigm shift that is important, and I think that historians need to embrace. And as many of you have seen the piece that I wrote for the Washington Post, which is true for think tanks, true for political science, true for history. If we don't understand these trends, if we don't embrace new paradigms, if we are not innovative and engaging, then we will go the way of dinosaurs. We need to rethink how we approach. Many universities, a number have contacted me because they're totally rethinking the time frame. And when I go back to the time frame of what it takes to publish a book, what it takes to have a journal reviewed, the timeline on that, which can be enhanced greatly by technology and a review process, is slow to happen within academia. But I have been approached by a number of universities, major universities, that are rethinking their track and tenure positions and engaging and thinking about incorporating new review process that is more democratic and dramatically accelerates the review of publications, and therefore makes it possible for journals to be more timely and reviewed with greater quality and diversity in terms of those who are reviewing them. The reality, whether it is an academic, whether it's a think tank, the reality in terms of policy is that it must be in the right form, at the right time, and in the right hands. And each one of these has a requirement that is fundamentally different than how most academics, most historians, most political scientists think. And so those are the sort of major part. And then I'll end on this segment on that no one reads. And certainly if you think the policymakers are reading what you write, think again. If they're reading a book, it's not about policy, it's not about history. They're on the beach, and it may be a romantic novel or a spy novel, but it's not the tomes that academics produce. I had a aha moment when I was trying to help my students at the University of Pennsylvania prepare for a midterm, and I was reviewing all the stuff that we had covered and what they needed to know. And a kid in the front row stood up and after I had gone through everything and said, "Dr. McGann, can't you just tell us what we need to know? Why do we have to read all this stuff?" And I'm thinking, and it totally changed how I teach. And certainly technology has done that, has to have more color, shorter points. You can't stand up and lecture and hope that or expect that the students will take copious notes and then be able to integrate that and provide a cogent essay at the end. The reality is that's not the case. And what I realized is it's the same with policymakers. The final part is that Henry Kissinger said, being a policymaker, which gets and integrates many of these points, is like being at the end of a fire hose, which doesn't translate well when I do this in other international audiences, but certainly is the case. And the reality is today, it's not just policymakers who are at the end of the fire hose. We are all at the end of a fire hose. We have an avalanche of information, and we have a daunting task of how to sort through all of the information of what's good, what's bad, and what's dangerous. And that is a new challenge. And that also poses a challenge for those who have great ideas. You better rethink how you're communicating them. You need to know that it is in the right form at the right time, in the right hands. And that has to be something that you just can't, in the historical sense of whether it's a think tank or an academic, that you will research it, write it, and people will build, and policymakers in particular, will beat a path to your door. Those days are over. My final set of comments are geared toward what I call, for the cornerstone of my research for the last 30 years. Why are there so many think tanks in the US? What makes it possible? How is it different than our closest relatives in Europe? And what explains why there are so many think tanks in Washington and throughout the United States, the country that has the largest number of think tanks than any other country in the world. Let me go through these quickly, and then I'll close. And if I've missed anything, I can be, there can be some follow-on questions if time permits. There's a fundamental difference between the US and Europe. And that fundamental difference explains why, in part, there are so many think tanks in the US. And it's not a simple, there's a multidimensional aspect of it. But I wrote a book about comparative politics, think tanks, and public policy to understand how and why there are more think tanks in certain countries relative to others. But in the US context, there are several factors, and let me go through them. One, we have a highly decentralized system, federal, state, and local. And that is an important function in terms of many countries where it is the political system is either centralized in Paris, and all decisions and policies emanate from there. And while there's local government, its role in shaping and defining policy is not very significant. In the US, as we have seen in terms of COVID and many other things, it may appear chaotic, but there is the federal, state, and local, and those rules may vary. It creates tensions, it creates complexity, but it also releases steam so that there isn't this focus, and there is the opportunity to innovate and have differences across the country. It's not without problems, but it does help explain why there are so many think tanks in the US, and I'll come back to that. We have separation of powers between legislative, executive, and judicial branch, and that is important for reasons that I'll come back to. The historical notion, which many think are, Bushian or Trumpian or conservative philosophy, is the government that governs least governs best. It goes back to the inception of the Republic and our relationship with the UK and the King, and that is deeply embedded in the political culture. And these elements that I'm mentioning are comparative politics in terms of the political culture and the political system, and how that influences and makes possible the large number of think tanks in the US. Additionally, de Tocqueville, when he roamed the United States early in the days of the Republic, noted that there were many, many factions, meaning which have now become known as interest groups in the United States. So both of these phenomena of the government that governs best governs least and interest groups were deeply embedded, not a recent phenomenon, but a deeply embedded in the political system and culture. Additionally, the US, by nature of those who came to it and what they were fleeing, was hyper-pluralist, or has become hyper-pluralistic. Every group, every cause has an organization to advance its interest and philosophy. We also have a 501c3, a system which is connected to the diversity, is connected to the factions, and in terms of religious and freedom of dissent and speech, is the fact that there's a mechanism whereby these institutions can be supported, which has furthered and increased the number of NGOs in the United States. And in that context, and in terms of fully understanding it, think tanks and other groups, interest groups, those who contribute, their tax burden is reduced commensurate with the amount of the contribution they make to an institution, with certain caps. But it's a huge incentive for people to give money to a range of causes in the US, which helps provide the financial support and the proliferation of these institutions. Finally, and embedded in most of this, is a distrust of government. And in that context, I would reference the civil service and provide an example to illustrate all of what I've just said. First of all, civil servants, and I've said this when I was speaking for the State Department, I'm a subject area specialist, and State Department officials and staff are in it. And I always have to qualify that, I'm not, this group is excluded from what I'm about to say. But most Americans have an incredible distrust of government, and specifically in terms of civil servants and the bureaucracy. In fact, they hold the bureaucracy and those who work in it just slightly below a used car salesman. So there's not any respect or interest, even though they are all well-meaning, hardworking employees. And here's where I'll make the shift. If you look at, and the fundamental and important segment in all of these things, it creates many points of access and therefore opportunities for interest groups and influences that are not present in our closest neighbors and the most pervasive political system. The presidential system that we have is fairly limited in terms of its application around the world, but the parliamentary system is much more widely adapted in terms of countries around the world, largely because of the colonial period. Why is this different? How does it impact the number? One, in the parliamentary system, as you all well know, the legislative and executive branch are fused. Their fates are tied together. And for that one limits access because you don't have the separation of powers that we have in the US. And the fate of the party and the prime minister are tied, fused with the legislative branch. The second part, which is one I've just referenced, is that the civil service in Europe is much stronger, and even in places in Asia like Japan. If you have entered, or in terms of the civil service in the UK, France, and Japan, and in some cases in Japan, you have ascended to heaven, that it is a career that is highly respected. The best schools and universities are the recruitment for those for civil servants is where it takes place. Now, these things are changing, but the reality is that that has deeply impacted the political system and culture. And I will close with the final example, which illustrates what I describe as American exceptionalism. And I understand that's controversial and problematic, but in this case, I think it applies. If you look, and I strongly encourage you in terms of two case examples, if you look at the 9/11 Commission, and if you look at the membership of the 9/11 Commission, it is not populated by leading civil servants from key and what might be perceived as logical offices within government and the bureaucracy. The vast majority, almost to the person, of the people who chaired that commission, the people who did the writing and analysis for that commission, all came from think tanks. Why is that? It is related to things that I mentioned: distrust of government, separation of powers, and the fact that we trust outside experts more than we trust those within government. That explains both the power, the pervasiveness and persuasiveness of think tanks and the role that they play. The second, which illustrates the seamless dimension, and this is my final point, is what is called the revolving door. If you look at the crisis that took place, economic crisis, global economic crisis that took place in 2008, when did it occur? It occurred and peaked in the early stages in November of 2008. At the same time, there was an election. George Bush lost, Obama won. And so in the US context, that, and in many governments, that means a transition period in which very little is done because people are trying to change their jobs, moving to the capital, etc. In this context, and because of what I term as the revolving door, meaning people that seamlessly go from business into government, or from think tanks into government, and in terms of the context is in very small numbers from academia into government, The reality is that the key people who were responsible for, and the architects, whether you agree with it or not, of the recovery and strategy to stabilize the global economy, all were at think tanks, all had been in government. They were seamlessly a part of this revolving door. And I would contend, because we were, a hair's breadth away from a catastrophic global meltdown that would have made 1929 look like a picnic, that the ability to have people in place who were working on the problem, and when they came into government in January, they hit the ground running. They were already working closely with the Bush administration, and George Bush Jr. was gracious and engaging and provided not impediments as Trump had, but really worked closely because he was a civil servant or a public servant in the broad sense of the word, and understood the gravity of the situation and wanted to work closely. And so the two administrations worked closely together, but the people who drove the process came from think tanks. Many were academics, but they had an understanding of government because they were in government. They understood the gravity of the situation, and they knew how to bring knowledge to bear on a dramatic and major problem we face. So I end there. Probably have gone on longer than I should, but I hope that you have found it useful and it covers the issues that you had asked me to cover. But if I haven't, you can redirect, as they say.
It raises so many interesting points. I don't want us to lose touch with it. And there's a crucial one, really, which is sort of the elephant in the room that we haven't really talked about, which is this clash of cultures between academia and policymakers. I mean, if you think about policy engagement, I mean, the UK had this wonderful model of policy engagement in sort of All Souls, Oxford, didn't it? And where kind of academics and policymakers sort of commingled, and they could commingle because they were the same sort of chaps. They went to the same schools, they spoke the same sort of language, they had the same frame of reference. That is never going to be replicated. The academy does not want to be a collection of chaps. It wants to be more diverse. It is encouraging diversity in thought and language. And with it, that comes a sort of distrust of power in many cases. And that, if anything, is a more fundamental barrier to engagement than simply the sort of processes Jim was talking about that encourage a certain level of specialization to get tenure. So is this now an insuperable barrier, you think, between really effective engagement between the academy and policymakers, or are there other ways around that? Who would like to take that on first? Catherine.
So one of the things that came across when we were doing these seminars on history was those people in the Treasury. Like I say, it's an extremely young department, even by Whitehall standards. You have a lot of people in their 20s, and it's quite a small department as well. And one of the things that was put to me, because they had this history network, I think they still do, and one of the things that was put to me was how valuable it was just simply of getting them out of their normal reference points, their normal cultural reference points, their normal paradigms of thinking and so forth, just to hear tales from the past, just to hear. So I said earlier, I've gone to some seminars where you will get a very dry presentation that starts off with lots of caveats, lots of methodology and so forth, and loses the audience. But likewise, I've been to many where it has engaged people and they've really enjoyed. It's the reason why we watch telly. It's the reason why we watch, Netflix so much. Some of it's maybe actual historical programs, but some of it's watching, you know, something set in South Korea, or it's I was watching Succession yesterday. Lots of historical parallels there. It's all about the Murdochs. So there is something that helps people to just hear history that isn't within their frame of reference, to be absorbed into it, to be told stories, to be told information, facts, analytical, you know, analytical ways into a historical period that they haven't thought about. But they've got to be set up and ready for that experience. They've got to be anticipating it, wanting it, and it's still got to be engaging enough. It's got to be good speakers. You know, you've got to think about perhaps the multimedia approach that you can bring to bear on it. But that's for those purposes. I think the rest of the time, yes, there is a problem in terms of the translation across. And I've written lots about the sort of the supply and the demand problems in terms of what it is that policymakers do, the speed of how they operate, the questions they're asking, and how those can clash sometimes with the academy. But this is one of the reasons, or one of the purposes of what think tanks do. A lot of the time, they are actually translating academic research to policymakers. They are bridging organizations. They do their own primary research, but they will also use quite a lot of secondary sources, whether that's data or whether that's, you know, books, interviews, journal articles, whatever it might be. So I think it's important to recognize that. I think the other thing, and this is why history and policy is really important, is that networks are so valuable because of, Philip, what you said about it was a very cozy atmosphere, and it was too cozy, and that led to groupthink. You know, we're very focused now on policy blunders, but actually you only need to, you know, there's so many in history. If we went and examined it through the same lens and the same kind of critical analytical approach that we apply to today's government, we would find that so many governments are incredibly inept. So we shouldn't glorify the past. We should embrace the diversity, want more of it, but appreciate that that means we need to do other things to develop networks, to help people find each other, to help, you know, policymakers understand where knowledge exists, how to access it, to think about portals and points of entry and so forth. But I think actually one of the things that really came strongly out of there, and it's something we encounter talking to academics all the time, is yeah, there is a huge problem in terms of the incentives for academics at the moment, and that publish or peril, can't remember if that's the phrase, sorry, is a huge problem. The incentives are for books and journals. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I left, you know, pure academia and ended up in the think tank world. I get extremely robust peer review, both from my colleagues, from external people across Whitehall, across different parts of the sort of the policy and politics world. But I don't have time to go through a formal academic peer review process. And I know how frustrating that can be for many people. You know, I'm working with some academics at the moment, and we're thinking about what can we publish on our website in January, February, and then they've got their journal articles, which they'll be looking at publishing in a year or, you know, year and a half from now. And that's very frustrating for academics who do want to engage, who have built up a Twitter profile, who have sought out these networks, that they're just not rewarded for that in the same way as getting your publication record up and the, you know, the importance of that for your future career.
Thanks very much. And before I ask Calder to come in on that, just to remind members of the audience, please do feel free to come in with your own questions. So either raise questions in the chat, or just say, Philip, I'd like to come in and ask a question, or even raise an electronic hand. So we'd like to hear from you before we sign out tonight. Calder, over to you.
Thanks, Philip. Bridging the gap between the academy and the policy field, the people that can do it successfully are few and far between, I think, historians, I should say. My colleague here, Frederick Logeval, I think is an outstanding example of someone that does have one foot in the academic squarely field, and then also produces policy relevant research. but it's not easy. And there is, as we've already mentioned, as Kath just sort of alluded to, there is a lot of resistance from within the academy to pure academic historians to producing policy relevant research. I think that this, my own view is that this is probably changing as departments of history, at least in US universities, are many of them are struggling with numbers of undergraduates taking history as a major. And it seems to me no coincidence that the universities that offer history undergraduate courses on big subjects, war and peace, are those where history departments are thriving. I'm thinking of Yale in particular. I think that the time lag that Kath mentioned between publication and policy relevance is absolutely key. I'd point members of the audience in the direction of the Texas National Security Review, which have really done a fantastic job there. For those that don't know, linked to War on the Rocks, they've done a fantastic job of peer reviewing, of streamlining the peer review process, and even, shock and awe, offering some money if you can get your review in, I think it's 2 weeks' time. So this, nothing will motivate historians like some cash, and that's been really successful. I said to them, sign me up for as many reviews as they can. And the Journal of Applied History, another, I think, doing great work of speeding up the process of peer review and bringing out policy relevant research as quickly as possible. Those are just two examples within my own immediate experience that I think have done really well.
Philip, sorry, if we've not got any questions coming through, I've got an additional point to add to that.
Yeah.
So we do a lot of work, as I say, on academia more generally and how they engage, including with the economic and social research historians, and there's a lot of efforts going on in that field as well, in terms of thinking about translation of academic research into government. And one of the things that they focused on there and in the sciences is the concept of synthesis. That a lot of academic research is very much focused on, the individual contribution that you're making, finding your niche new area and really sort of delving into that in great depth. But actually, a lot of times what policymakers want is breadth rather than depth. There will be times when they want depth, but a lot of times they just want an introduction to the issues, perhaps suggestions of where to go with it, perhaps connections to other people. And so don't be afraid of being the person that actually gives them that broad sweeping perspective to help them understand the framing of the issue, to allow them to go into the right areas in more depth. And I think that's also a challenge for us, though. And it's a challenge for me because as a historian of government, I don't know every policy that's occurred and I don't know the deep history of it, but I often get asked as if I do. But I try more and more to sort of understand the framework, to understand what the likely questions they will need to ask when interrogating the history of that particular policy, that background, and so forth. We've also we've taken a bit of a leaf out of Harvard's Kennedy School approach, and are trying to produce more and more case studies as a learning tool to help people understand many different aspects of policy making, whether it's the process itself, whether it's sort of particular dimensions. We did one just looking at success factors for policy because we felt that too much of the focus was on failures in policy making. So I think there's lots of different ways that you can do history, which unfortunately isn't the kind of stuff that's revered. It's not necessarily the big tome. It can be the Wikipedia level entry points for people, and we need to think about how we're doing that. It's what historians do for students. So it's not that much different from what is in our wheelhouse, is how to teach history, not just to sort of to write it and to explore it.
We've got a question from Pan. Has his hand up. Would you like to come in, Pan? And this might have to be the final question.
Yes. So thanks to everyone for such an engaging talk. So I'm actually tuning in all the way from Thailand. Perhaps this is too much of an amateurish question to ask, but I was just wondering if you feel that there is a need in academic spheres to make communication skills compulsory, in this case with policymakers as part of academia. I'm not sure, but from the impression I get, the majority of examples that you mentioned, e.g. like training seminars and so on, seem kind of voluntary, and academics learn about communicating solely by experience than by perhaps anything that is more established by theory or, you know, a rule book of how to, you know, to put themselves forward. Yeah.
Calder, I feel I've talked too much, so I'll be very brief on this. I think we need to take the same lessons that science takes. And when we talk about applied history, we need to reward those people who are good at it and make sure there is a proper career development for them when that is their skill set, when that is what they can particularly bring to bear on it. I think we don't want to make, you know, to undermine, again, to take a lesson from science, blue skies research. We need historians who are going to be incredibly in-depth, focused on a very niche, important area, and make sure that that contribution to the sum of human knowledge continues. So we don't want everyone to work the same. The problem is we're not rewarding those people that do have a different skill set or can translate it into sort of applied policy-oriented research.
Thank you. You just answered it much better than I could. So you stole my thunder. And I just echo and emphasize that I think that historians, we could learn a lot from scientists. Colleagues of mine who are scientists, as part of their PhD programs, are given courses on interacting with the media and how to speak to media about your very technical expertise. And I think that we historians would certainly benefit from that. I wouldn't make it mandatory, but I think that this is something that if you are embarking on a career as a historian and you know that you want to be involved in public policy impact, then this is absolutely key. And my own experience that wasn't taught sufficiently well, and my feeling is that it's not taught adequately here still.
Yeah, sorry, Philip.
Yeah, no,
just a very final thought, just because you've mentioned media, Calder. It's something I often tell to historians I've worked with or in the past and so forth. Do not, especially with media, do not underestimate how much the thing that you think is really obvious is not known by people. So even telling, you know, the most basic historical stories accurately but succinctly, that seem to you quite basic, for the media, you know, sometimes just that is so important to them. So don't underestimate how the obvious actually is really useful.
I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but Random House did a study of the number of people that actually read books. And it's staggeringly small, and most people, like the overwhelming majority, get 2 chapters in. So not only with public policy, but also with the media, if your introduction, if you want to call it an introduction in your book, doesn't really contain the central argument, alas, and it's buried within the 10th chapter or 11th chapter, alas, it's not going to get noticed. Certainly not by the media in their busy schedules, but probably not even by general readers either. So that's quite an eye-opener for me when I realized that.
Well, that's a good note on which to end things, because we've got to 7 o'clock. I was thinking when Catherine was talking earlier of this story I heard from someone who was in the local chip shop in Yorkshire, and they got to the counter and the chip shop owner said to them, "Do you want the same?" He said, "Not the same, similar." And I think that's sort of what we're saying to policymakers. The present may not be the same as the past, but it might be similar in interesting ways. And how we how we communicate that is tremendously important, but it's the, it's the mission behind history and policy and behind the things that you did, Calder, and you, Catherine, extremely well. So thank you so much for sharing your experience with us tonight. I'm so glad we recorded this. I think it would be of great value and interest. And thank you everyone for taking part. And thank you, Jacob, for kicking us off with your excellent policy paper. So thank you and have a very good evening, everyone.